So let me ask you something. What comes to mind when you hear Russia-Ukraine war? Chaos? Tragedy? Maybe even courage? Because honestly, this story has all of that and more.
Absolutely. It's not just a war about land or politics, it's about identity, survival, and the future of two nations. What's even more striking is how it all started in 2014. A covert invasion of Crimea, masked soldiers with no insignia, and a sham referendum. But it didn't stop there, did it?
Not even close. That was just the beginning. By 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion, thinking they'd take Kyiv in days. Instead, they faced fierce resistance, and Ukraine turned the tables. It's incredible how they stood their ground, especially with the odds stacked against them.
And the human cost is staggering. Millions of people displaced, thousands of lives lost, and cities left in ruins. Yet, amidst all this, Ukraine has shown incredible resilience, defying expectations at every turn.
It's a story of a smaller nation refusing to bow to a larger power, of leadership under fire, and the world being forced to pick sides. And today, we're diving into this complex, heartbreaking, yet inspiring tale.
Stick with us. There's so much to uncover about how this all unfolded and where it's headed. Let's dive in.
You know, the roots of the Russia-Ukraine war really take us back to the winter of 2013-2014. It all started with the Euromaidan protests in Kyiv. Thousands of people gathered in Independence Square, demanding change.
Yeah, it was incredible how quickly things escalated. At first, it was about something specific: Ukraine signing an association agreement with the European Union. People wanted closer ties with Europe, not Russia. But when President Viktor Yanukovych decided to reject the deal and lean toward Russia, the anger exploded.
It wasn't just anger, it was determination. Protesters didn't leave the square for months, even in freezing temperatures. At one point, over 500,000 people were there. Young students started it, but soon people of all ages joined.
Right, and the government tried everything to shut them down. Riot police beat protesters, journalists were attacked, and laws were passed to ban demonstrations. But the crackdown only made the movement stronger. By February 2014, the conflict hit its peak.
The worst was when snipers opened fire on the crowd. More than 80 people were killed in just a few days. Yet, even that couldn't crush their spirit. Within days, Yanukovych fled the country, and the parliament removed him from office.
But his exit left Ukraine vulnerable. It created a power vacuum that gave Russia the perfect opportunity to step in. What started as a fight for democracy turned into something much bigger, something far more dangerous.
Right after Yanukovych fled, things took a dramatic turn. While Ukraine was trying to stabilize, Russia moved swiftly into Crimea. Do you remember how they did it?
Oh yes, those so-called little green men. Russian troops in unmarked uniforms took over Crimea's government buildings in February 2014. At first, Moscow denied any involvement, but it was clear they were Russian soldiers.
Exactly. They acted fast, too. Within days, they installed a pro-Russian leader, held a highly questionable referendum, and declared that Crimea wanted to join Russia. Over 95% supposedly voted in favor, but the vote was anything but fair.
I mean, how could it be? The region was under military occupation, international observers were banned, and voters faced intense pressure. Most of the world condemned the move, calling it an illegal annexation.
What made Crimea so important to Russia? Was it just about land?
Not just land, strategy. Crimea hosts the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. Losing control of that would have been a massive blow to Russia's military reach. By taking Crimea, they secured that naval base and sent a message to the world. They were willing to break international laws to protect their interests.
And for Ukraine, it was devastating. Losing Crimea was a huge blow to their sovereignty. Worse, it showed just how far Russia was willing to go. This annexation marked the start of something much bigger, an even darker chapter in this story.
After Crimea, Russia didn't stop. By spring 2014, the focus shifted to eastern Ukraine, especially the Donbas region. That's where the real fighting started.
Right. It began with small groups of armed men seizing government buildings in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kharkiv. Russia called them local militias, but it quickly became clear they were backed, and in many cases led, by Russian forces.
And just like in Crimea, they staged referenda. Separatists declared independence for Donetsk and Luhansk, forming self-proclaimed people's republics. But Ukraine didn't recognize them, of course, and sent in troops to retake the areas.
That's when the conflict turned violent. Skirmishes became full-scale battles. By the summer of 2014, the Donbas was a war zone. Russia supplied the separatists with weapons, money, and even soldiers. It was a proxy war, but with very real casualties.
The human cost was staggering. Thousands of civilians were caught in the crossfire. Entire towns were destroyed, and people fled in droves. By the end of the year, more than 4,700 people had been killed, and the numbers kept climbing.
And let's not forget the international shockwaves. The downing of Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 by a Russian-made missile in July 2014 put a global spotlight on the war. Nearly 300 innocent people were killed.
It showed just how dangerous the situation had become. What started as local unrest escalated into an international crisis, with no easy solution in sight. And for Ukraine, the battle for Donbas was far from over.
Fast forward to 2022, and things took an even darker turn. Russia didn't just stop at supporting separatists or holding on to Crimea. They launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Do you remember the buildup?
Oh, it was impossible to ignore. Late in 2021, Russia started amassing troops along Ukraine's borders, about 190,000 soldiers, plus tanks and aircraft. They claimed it was for military exercises, but no one believed that.
Then came February 24th, 2022. Putin announced a special military operation. But let's be honest, it was an outright war. Minutes later, missiles hit cities across Ukraine, including Kyiv. Explosions, air raid sirens, chaos everywhere.
It was shocking how quickly they moved. Russian forces captured Hostomel Airport near Kyiv and pushed toward the capital. They expected to take the city in days, maybe even hours. But Ukraine didn't crumble.
Not at all. Ukrainian defenders fought back fiercely, stopping Russian advances at key points. President Zelensky became a symbol of resistance when he refused to leave Kyiv, famously saying, "I need ammunition, not a ride."
And let's not forget the international response. The West hit Russia with massive sanctions. Banks frozen, assets seized, trade restricted. Meanwhile, countries like the US, the UK, and Poland sent military aid to Ukraine.
That aid made a difference. Systems like HIMARS gave Ukraine the ability to strike back, targeting Russian supply lines and command centers. And despite early gains, Russia's forces started showing weaknesses: poor logistics, low morale, and stiff resistance from Ukraine.
But the cost was high. Thousands of civilians were killed, millions fled their homes, and cities like Mariupol were reduced to rubble. The invasion brought devastation, but it also showed the world Ukraine's strength and resilience.
And this was just the start of a brutal and prolonged fight that would change the course of history.
Let's talk about the two faces of this war: Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin. They couldn't be more different, right?
Absolutely. On one side, you've got Zelensky, a former comedian and actor who starred in a show about becoming president. No one expected him to be a wartime leader, but he's proven himself, hasn't he?
He has. Zelensky didn't just stay in Kyiv when the bombs started falling. He rallied his people. His speeches went viral, inspiring Ukrainians to fight and convincing the world to support their cause.
And then there's Putin. For him, this war is all about power and control. He's been in charge of Russia for over 20 years, building an image of strength. But this invasion has exposed cracks in his strategy, hasn't it?
Big cracks. Putin underestimated Ukraine's resistance and the global response. He thought he could divide NATO, but instead, the alliance grew stronger. Finland and Sweden even joined because of him.
And yet, Putin remains relentless. He controls the narrative inside Russia, using propaganda to justify the war and silence dissent. His leadership style is all about fear and domination.
Meanwhile, Zelensky leads by example. He's not just fighting for Ukraine's land, he's fighting for its identity, its democracy. The contrast between these two leaders says so much about what this war is really about.
It's a battle between oppression and freedom, and the stakes couldn't be higher for Ukraine and the world.
When the full-scale invasion began, many thought Ukraine wouldn't last. But by mid-2022, we saw something remarkable. Ukraine fighting back, not just defending, but reclaiming lost ground.
Right? And it wasn't just luck. Ukraine's military strategy, boosted by Western support, completely shifted the momentum. Take the liberation of Kherson in November 2022, for example. That was a major turning point.
Absolutely. Kherson was the only regional capital Russia captured, and losing it was a huge blow to Putin. Ukrainian forces used precision strikes with HIMARS to weaken Russian supply lines, forcing their retreat.
And let's not forget Kharkiv. In September 2022, Ukraine launched a surprise counteroffensive in the region. Within a week, they had liberated thousands of square kilometers, including key towns like Izium. Russian troops fled, leaving behind weapons and supplies.
That's when people started realizing the power of Ukraine's determination and tactics. They didn't just rely on manpower. They used advanced systems like drones and modern artillery to outsmart Russian forces.
And then there's the sinking of the Moskva in April 2022. That Russian warship wasn't just a piece of equipment. It was a symbol of their naval power. Ukraine took it down with locally made Neptune missiles, boosting morale and showing they could hit hard.
These victories were a mix of smart planning and resilience. But the human cost was enormous. Cities were left in ruins, and soldiers endured grueling battles. For Ukraine, every win came with sacrifice.
Still, these counteroffensives proved one thing: Ukraine wouldn't back down. Each victory inspired more global support, giving hope that they could stand against one of the world's largest armies.
And that determination is what keeps this fight going, even in the toughest moments.
You know, it's easy to get caught up in the military strategies and battlefield victories. But we can't forget the real heart of this war: the people. The human cost has been staggering.
Absolutely. Millions of Ukrainians have been displaced. Over 8 million fled the country, while millions more are internally displaced. Families torn apart, homes destroyed, and lives turned upside down. It's hard to imagine the scale of it.
And then there are the casualties. Civilian deaths have been horrifying. Take Mariupol, for example. Tens of thousands were killed there, and the siege left the city in ruins. Some shelters, like the drama theater, were deliberately bombed despite housing children.
The atrocities go even deeper. In towns like Bucha, mass graves were uncovered, and civilians were tortured and executed. These aren't just numbers. They're people. Lives ended in the most brutal ways.
And let's not forget the forced deportations. Russia has been accused of abducting thousands of Ukrainian children, sending them into Russian territory. It's a war crime that adds another layer of heartbreak to an already devastating situation.
Despite all this, the resilience of the Ukrainian people is extraordinary. Even in the face of unimaginable loss, they keep fighting, not just for their land, but for their families, their future, their identity.
This war has shown the worst of humanity, but also its strength and courage. The pain is undeniable, but so is the will to survive and rebuild.
This war hasn't just shaken Ukraine and Russia, it's sent shockwaves around the world. In many ways, it feels like a new Cold War has started, doesn't it?
It really does. NATO, for instance, has seen a revival. After years of doubt about its relevance, the alliance has grown stronger. Finland and Sweden joined, which would have been unthinkable before this war.
And let's not forget the economic fallout. Sanctions against Russia have cut them off from much of the global economy. They've become more isolated than ever, relying on countries like China and even North Korea to keep afloat.
Exactly. But those sanctions have ripple effects. Energy prices soared, and many countries, especially in Europe, had to rethink their dependence on Russian oil and gas. It's been a wake-up call for energy independence.
And look at how alliances have shifted. Nations like Poland and the Baltic states are now at the center of Europe's defense strategy. Meanwhile, countries like Turkey are playing a delicate balancing act between NATO and Russia.
The war has also changed how we view global security. Cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and economic warfare are now just as important as what happens on the battlefield.
It's clear this war has reshaped geopolitics. The world feels more divided, and the stakes are higher than ever. The question is, what comes next?
As of now, the war shows no signs of ending. Ukraine has regained some ground, like in Kherson and Kharkiv, but much of its territory is still under Russian occupation. The front lines are grinding, with both sides locked in fierce battles.
And the stakes keep rising. Russia has shifted to attrition warfare, relying on sheer numbers and heavy bombardments. Ukraine, on the other hand, focuses on precision strikes and counterattacks. But they're struggling with ammunition shortages as Western aid fluctuates.
Meanwhile, the human suffering continues. Cities like Avdiivka and Bakhmut have been turned into wastelands. Civilians endure power outages, missile strikes, and constant fear. And winter always brings new hardships, especially for those displaced by the fighting.
On the global stage, the war has redrawn alliances. NATO's expansion and unified support for Ukraine are huge, but tensions between the West and countries like China and North Korea are growing. The longer this war drags on, the more unstable the world becomes.
The future feels uncertain. Can Ukraine hold out? Will Russia push harder? Or will there finally be a breakthrough toward peace?
One thing's for sure, this war has changed everything for Ukraine, for Russia, and for the world. Whatever happens next, it will leave a mark on history that won't be forgotten.